Welcome to Prescribing Prosperity with your hosts, John and Alex Soutsos from MedWealth Financial Services, operating through IPC Securities Corporation. In this podcast, we provide unique insights into wealth management, the psychology of financial decisions, and help listeners place the capital markets into perspective. Our aim is to help physicians, business owners, and other medical professionals to live their dream. Life is to live and enjoy, so we'll also cover health and lifestyle-related topics such as food, dining, travel, and unique experiences. Learn how global trends shape our investment strategy as we help you assemble your roadmap to prosperity.
Hello, and welcome to the Prescribing Prosperity podcast with John and Alex Soutsos. Guys, this is part 2 of a really fascinating discussion. I can't wait for it to resume. It's good to be with you again. How are y'all?
We're doing well, thank you.
Doing great, Bill. How are you?
I'm great. And I'm eager to get into this topic. I have deliberately muted my microphone during episode 1. I will keep it down during episode 2 because you just don't need to hear me screaming like I'm screaming. We're talking about the taxes and the economy in Canada, and the guest that you guys have is just fantastic. I'm enjoying listening to his observations and his commentary. Kim Moody. Kim, for those of you who don't know him, is a CPA. He is the founder and director of Moody's Private Client and Moody's Tax, one of Canada's premier tax law and accounting firms. He is an Amazon best-selling author, and he is one of the preeminent thought leaders on public policy. Please, to God's ears, may that be true. And he is a regular contributor to the Financial Post. Kim, good to have you back with us. I'm enjoying this conversation. I'm going to turn this back over now. John, Alex, one of you guys can take it from here.
Sure thing, Bill. We'll take it back over here. Kim, continuing with our conversation, where we last left off, we started to just briefly touch upon the notion of budgets and how it's an important component of what should be good government policy, but is not necessarily the case. You know, I have a 2-year-old son. You mentioned having some adult children. I have a 2-year-old son. I'm going to have another one any day now, and
nice. Congrats.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm used to smelling my fair share of dirty diapers, and when that budget came out last week, it was worse than my son after a very indulgent meal. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about the Canadian budget that was just released about a week and a half ago, and you've done a great job in recent weeks unpacking some of the headline items. Can you walk us through some of those key changes, beginning with the capital gains inclusion rate? I know we already talked about it a little bit, but let's delve a little bit deeper into the total impact that will have on the economy.
Sure. So I have to admit that I was a little surprised to see that proposal, because there's been many people who've cried wolf over the years in my profession and the legal profession that have suggested that in this coming budget, there's going to be a capital gains inclusion rate. And I've always been one of the people that have said, nah, I don't see it. You know, and it's been this way for 24 years. I just don't see it. Because the last time we had a capital gains inclusion rate was in the year 2000, or sorry, decreases, because it started at 75% inclusion rate and went all the way down to 50 in 2 stages. So I just didn't see the circumstances being all that different to increase it, notwithstanding, you know, our horrible economic financial situation. And as a matter of fact, in my Financial Post piece, the day before the budget was released, I was on record saying I just don't see it. Having said that, right after the piece was released, we got these strategic leaks, which have been very common over the years. That, you know, it was leaked that there's going to be something attacking the wealthy, and I thought, oh, here we go. And I actually thought it would be a personal tax rate increase, but I thought they wouldn't pull out the capital gains inclusion rate, but they did, and they did it around the messaging of 0.13% of individuals being affected, and they pulled out some shitty statistics to support that. It was so manipulative on the statistics. And so it will have a broad-based impact, because the way they're doing it is that they're going to maintain the 50% inclusion rate to the extent that you have annual capital gains of $250,000 or less. That's for individuals. But there is no such exception or threshold for trusts or corporations. And to make it even worse, we don't have any draft legislation to even analyze some of the complexities. And there is a ton of complexities involved in this. And we find out that the Department of Finance, the tax legislation and the bureaucrat division, has a long ways to go to finish drafting this legislation, but apparently Canadians are supposed to start planning and get ready for this because it comes into effect June the 25th of this year.
Mhm.
And today, we're into May of 24. That's not a long ways away, right?
No.
Now, to make it even worse, the implications of this are very broad. I already mentioned in the first time we chatted was, pension funds, for example, or try that again, public companies that pay dividends, they're going to be affected, which impacts a huge amount of Canadians by way of reduced dividends, either short-term or long-term. It also will impact people that hold cottages. And frankly, you don't need to be a multimillionaire to hold second properties like cottages or rental properties. A lot of people buy those properties in order to supplement their wealth or income. And there's literally millions of Canadians that hold these properties, and the capital gains are lumpy during their lifetime. And so it'll be effective then. People that die, which once in a while people die. And so on occasion. And so we know that that's inevitably going to happen. And frankly, for most, that is the largest capital gains realization date, because when you die, you're deemed to have disposed of all of your assets at fair market value. And so if you have capital property that has a large gain, it'll be realized. And to the extent that's over 250, which for many it will be, you're going to be impacted. And so this line of 0.13% is total crap, total misleading, disingenuous. I hesitate to say that it's a lie, but if it's not a lie, it's damn close to it.
Well, Kim, if you, sorry to interrupt you, but elaborating on the point you're making, our constituency in terms of clientele includes a large number of medical professionals who have medical professional corporations.
Yep.
And how is this going to impact them?
Well, it's not just doctors, right? Doctors tend to be the most vocal when tax changes come up, and I'm quasi-sympathetic to them, but not really, because thankfully they have people like you to help educate them. I'm on record for saying that doctors and lawyers are some of the most uneducated people when it comes to finances ever. And frankly, in medical school, in my view, and lawyers as well, should be forced to take basic business courses, in my view, but they don't. So anyhow, that's a digression. To go to your question, will it impact them? Sure it will, because most of them invest in their PCs for retirement. They're going to have ongoing capital gains if their funds are properly invested, and will it result in higher tax? Yes, it will, on an ongoing basis because of the way the system is designed. And so long story short is that it's not just doctors. Now it's accountants like me who, my PC is my retirement vehicle, along with some other supplementary things like RSPs and what have you, but that's my retirement vehicle. And so it's going to impact me. It's going to impact lawyers who have the very similar thing. It's going to impact the average business owner who uses their company as a retirement vehicle as well. Or when they sell their shares, if they can't utilize the capital gains deduction, then all of a sudden they've got to pay higher capital gains tax. And I think we talked about your hockey player buddy, Alex, who says, the impact is pretty minor. No, it's not. It's big. In Alberta, my home province, it's an 8% increase in tax on a disposition. Huge. It's massive. And so that naive comment, frankly, is just silly, right? And uninformed and uneducated. So I could go on, John, but the long story short is that was the major budget announcement. The other highlight announcement that came out, which is really, they came out with this announcement called the Canadian Entrepreneurs Incentive. Oh. And when I was reading the budget documents, I thought, wow, geez, $2 million incentive. That's pretty cool. And so then I start reading, the details, which frankly, there is no details other than the stuff that they came out with in the budget material. There's no draft legislation on this. But it turns out that they want to allow a $2 million exemption in addition to the capital gains deduction. So on its face, it's 2 million plus 1.25 exemption, which, okay, that's pretty significant. But here's the caveats. It's going to be phased in $200,000 per year starting next year. Okay, fine. So it'll take a while to get to 2 million, 10 years. But there's a whole bunch of restrictions on the shares that you have to dispose. So if you sell assets, you're out. There's no incentive. But if you sell shares, it has to be so-called founders shares, which don't really understand what that means. Like, let's say you did an estate freeze. Do those preferred shares count? Don't know. And then what about and then they list all these industries that are exceptions. If you're in an industry that you're not going to be able to utilize the exception. And the list is long. And it includes entertainment and arts and recreation and food and consulting and personal care. And when you look at that list, it's like, well, holy crap, what's left? Well, the only thing that's left, from what I can see, is technology. So they want to encourage technology. Okay, why don't you just say that? And then 2, maybe some construction related industries. But the vast majority of your clients, like doctors and any other business owners, professionals, business owners, like professionals are out as well. I should have included that in the list of exceptions. And so really, this is another, let's make the number big and show that we're supporting entrepreneurs. But then when you drill into the details, it's like, this is all highlight stuff. This is all just pablum to feed to the media so that they think they're supporting entrepreneurs, when really, in reality, they're not. And that's what this budget is. It's pablum. It's total pablum.
There's no substance behind it. I really liked how you broke that down. I listened to your podcast last week. Actually, I was driving into hockey, and I was getting really worked up as I was driving in there. Maybe that's why I played well. I was listening to it, and I'm listening as you're going through it and checking off all those different industries. 'Cause I was kind of doing the same thing in my mind. I'm thinking, okay, so who's that going to benefit? And you're throwing all these industries out the window. I was thinking, what the frick is left, man? Like, this is ridiculous. And to go back to your point about the business owners, so like you mentioned, so many of them retire, or so much of their retirement plan is the sale of their business. And for those individuals who have poured their blood, sweat, and tears into their careers, into their business, who are near the end of the line now, to now realize that they thought they were at the finish line, and somebody just picked up the finish line and just ran further away from them. They just ran 17% further away from them. It must be so incredibly disheartening and crushing and infuriating at the same time, to say nothing of the fact that the capital gains inclusion rate going up right now by June 24th, I believe it was, is nothing more than a contrived revenue raising venture for this year in order to make this particular deficit look good, so they can say we held firm at what was it, $40 billion for this year as the deficit, and most of it's coming, or a large portion of it is coming from this tax raising.
Well, just to jump in there, Alex, I've spoken and written on this quite a bit, and again, that's part of the disingenuousness of this. So they choose a June 25th date, which seems rather arbitrary, of roughly 10 weeks from April 16th. I don't think there's any more magic than that, from what we can tell. But they are encouraging Canadians to crystallize and monetize prior to June 25th. And when you look at the actual documents in the budget, and this is probably what you're referring to if you listen to my podcast, I think I talked about it. Right in the budget documents, there's the so-called revenue generation that they expect from certain tax measures, or what it's going to cost the government. In this particular one, the capital gains inclusion rate for corporations is expected to raise $4.6 billion for this year. But then it drops back down the following year to, I'm trying to remember what the number is, somewhere around 1.3 billion.
Yeah, that's what
now think about that. Just rounding up, 5 billion they expect to raise for corporations alone. That doesn't include individuals. But then drop down dramatically the next year. And actually, if you look at the documents, they're expecting to lose money the second following year. Now, why? Because there's likely going to be some capital losses, right? So you think about just the sheer ballsiness of of what they're trying to do, as you already mentioned. They're trying to make their deficit look good by holding the line in quotation marks. But if they took away that measure, their budget actually increases by another 5 billion. I actually think, when the numbers actually come in, and I'm anxious to see it, that they're not even going to come close to the $5 billion number. That's my prediction.
Do you think they're going to be short of it? Or do you think they'll exceed it?
They'll be short of it. I flip-flopped on this prediction. I thought about 10 days ago, I thought that, actually they'll exceed it. But the more I think about this and the more I talk to clients, it's like, what? You want me to prepay tax? Well, that's a present value calculation, right? Yeah. Because why would I, and you guys are the experts here, but why would I prepay tax if my rate of return, like for example, I did some math with my buddy, Jay Goodis, who we do this thing called Canadian Tax Matters, and we did a presentation to 400 accountants last week. And Jay built this really good break-even analysis and on just a rough $1 million gain that you're triggering. And if you expect a 6% rate of return on that money and over time, which of course in reality, it's lumpy, it's not a flat 6% for entrepreneurs, but the payback period is 7 years. Why would we want to do that if the payback is 7 years? Mm-hmm. So it's that kind of analysis that I think if you're doing it correctly, I don't think there's going to be a lot of people racing to monetize.
That's a great point, and I really like how because that is a very logical and rational way to think about it, and I think there's a lot of people tend to jump to to irrational conclusions, and that's a very methodical and thorough way to approach it. But the way that I have viewed this at least attempt to contrive people's behavior, manipulate people's behaviors, it's nothing more than maneuvering for the election. We know there's an election next year.
Completely.
And so all they're doing is they're putting down little crumbs, little bits of candy for people to follow on their way to the ballot box and check off the red box again. So
this is pablum. This is political pablum is what it is, because they pulled out the attack on the rich again, thinking that it would work, and thankfully it seems like it's not. Right? If you look at some of the polling numbers, I think there's been significant pushback, which is good. Yeah. Hopefully, it can sustain itself. Mm-hmm. But the second thing is that they're getting the support of left-wing economists who say that this is equitable and the sky's not going to fall by this and it's the best of a bad alternative, and of course cutting spending that's not in their best interest politically. Mm-hmm. And so the logical arguments go out the window, right? So this is complete political posturing, thinking that they're going to get a post-budget bump in support. And I think they miscalculated. I just, fingers crossed, I hope that it sustains itself though.
I hope you're right. And I know I've seen the numbers. I saw that he was actually down there, or they were down in the polling, especially amongst the younger Canadians, which is the demographic they've been hemorrhaging, and we're trying to get back. And so you actually dovetailed nicely into my next question, which was this notion that a tax dollar is a tax dollar. And you talked a little bit about it on your podcast. I hope you wouldn't mind elaborating on it here about how that is complete and utter nonsense and how it disincentivizes people to invest. And I'll let you take over.
Sure. So the context and the history here is that, and I already mentioned the Royal Commission on Taxation in the first segment that we had. And part of the recommendation that the Carter Commission had was that capital gains should be taxable. Because during that time, capital gains were never taxable. And it was only from 1972 forward that capital gains were taxable. And one of the policy reasons why capital gains are not taxable is, that the governments of the day and wanted to encourage entrepreneurship and wanted to encourage capital being at risk and et cetera, et cetera. So to the extent that you did that and you had some economic gains, then not taxable. Hmm. But the commission said, well, hold on a second here. A buck is a buck is a buck. That's the famous line that comes out of it. And, Carter was not wrong. When you get $1, it doesn't really matter what form that is, either salary or dividends or interest income or capital gains. It's still $1. And that's what he meant by that. And what they're advocating for was that capital gains should be taxable. Now, that recommendation is something that was hotly debated. And And ultimately you had people saying, well, hold on a second. Yes, a buck is a buck is a buck. But to earn that buck is very different than the other salary, dividends, interest, for example, or rents. So you can't just look at it and say, it should be taxable, because there's a risk profile attached to each of this. If you're a salaried employee, there's not a lot of risk. Yes, you could get fired. Yes, your company could go bankrupt, but there's not a lot of risk involved. To earn interest income, not a lot of risk there, right? Typically, but when you jump the shark, actually, that's a bad example. When you become an entrepreneur, there's a lot of risk involved. Or if you're doing a startup, or if you're trying to invest in an unknown, there's a lot of risk involved. And so you need to have incentives in order to encourage people to risk, so that ultimately they can earn it. And ultimately, after much debate, they landed on a rough inclusion rate of 50%. Okay, fine. In order to encourage investment and to compensate for the risk that's involved, we'll just, here's the rough solution: 50% income inclusion. One can debate whether or not that's correct or not, but that's what they landed on. And so when you hear this trotting of a buck is a buck is a buck by left-wing academics, that's the context and the history behind it. But they are simply not looking at the risk profile and not taking into account real life. Because in real life, as you guys know, if my $1 million capital gain, if I'm going to invest in a rental property and my $1 million capital gain is going to be taxed like a salary, am I going to do that?
No,
not a chance.
What for?
Absolutely no. I'll look for other ways to invest, and frankly, that's what's happening. Is we have
and
go ahead.
I was just going to say, and Kim, who was the prime minister of the day on Valuation Day, December 31, 1971?
Good old Trudeau Senior.
Yeah.
So
yeah. What's the expression? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Yeah.
Yeah. To be fair, I think Trudeau Senior was a lot more, what's the word? Bright. I didn't agree with his ideology, but at least he was thoughtful, and he could. Whereas this particular prime minister is just all about ideology. Who cares about the details and dotting I's and crossing T's? This is all ideology.
Is this the most economically illiterate government in Canadian history?
In my opinion, yes. And is this the most shittiest budget I've seen in my career? Yes, because I wasn't around in 1981 during the McEachran budget, which I think historically, I think you were around, John.
I was, yes, I was. I remember it. Albertans didn't like it.
No. And ultimately, that was, I stand to be corrected here, but I think historically, that is one of the only budgets that was walked back in Canadian history.
Really?
And then Alan McEachran was fired. And so that's, I don't know if we're approaching that kind of level of shittiness, but it's damn close in this particular budget.
I think there's going to be some walking back before June 25th. I think the outrage at this current budget is growing by the day. And there's going to, at a minimum, I think you're going to see a delay in that date, and they're going to push it back.
I don't agree. Have you not seen how obstinate this government has been, how irrationally they have behaved over the last 10 years? I don't for a second think that they'll even consider walking it back.
Here's my 2 cents if you want my 2 cents.
Yes, please.
But before I give it to you, were you aware of my writings on the Saskatoon press conference that he had about 10 days ago, where he basically said no? So he was defending the budget because reporters are asking him about the capital gains inclusion rate, and he launched into this just complete speaking points, which are so obviously fed to him by the Prime Minister's office, that if you were, it's not right that if you can hire an accountant, your tax bill is cut in half.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
And you see that, and which is blatantly false again, and an attack on accountants. And so, of course, me being an accountant, I had
it's
to
a
push
complete
back.
lie. Never mind blatantly false. That's a lie.
It is a complete lie. They might be talking about surplus stripping, which are transactions that, for very, very few you can do. but to suggest it's for the masses is just ridiculous. And then secondly, he said, this measure is necessary. What kind of Canada do you want to live in? This measure is necessary to provide intergenerational fairness. The average person is not even going to think about what does intergenerational fairness mean. And even if you Google intergenerational fairness, which I did, and looked at some of these academic papers that are just hogwash nonsense, that's the kind of stuff that you see defended. So my observation is that I think we may see some minimal relief provided, and in particular, the Joint Committee on Taxation released last week, and they're not an advocacy body, and I used to be the co-chair of the Joint Committee on Taxation. All they do is respond to technical matters on tax proposals, and they had a long list of things that if this is going to go through, that the government should consider, including a delayed implementation date and an election rather than an election to have a disposition to crystallize rather than forcing people to actually crystallize.
Right.
These are very good points that are made. And so I can see the government responding to technical things like that. But on the ideological side, these guys, I think, are so bloody entrenched in their ideology that I think they're going to go down with the ship. That's my view.
On the subject of intergenerational fairness, where was that consideration when they keep borrowing from the future to provide equity in the present?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So like my son Alex and his generation are paying the price for our generation to provide equity.
Yeah, and it's nonsense, as you know, John. And I wrote about this in my post piece, and I think I talked about this in the first segment that we had. But what we're paying on public debt charges? What is projected to be for public debt charges this coming year?
Yeah,
$56 billion.
I think it's 54.1 billion, because I had a chance to double check. I think I said 56 in the last segment.
Yeah,
and that's a double of, what is it, 4 years ago? Well, and some of that, of course, is higher interest rates, no doubt, but it's also accumulated debt and continuing to accumulate debt, and we have a real problem that we're passing to our younger generations, like Alex and his new child coming up and his existing child.
So
that's a real problem.
My grandchildren are going to be paying for the grandiose ideological narrative of the current liberal government.
Completely.
Now, it isn't. It is, and it is very vexing to say the least. I'm gonna, before we start getting into a quick future perspective here, Kim, I have two quick questions for you. Number one, can you talk a little bit about why they haven't implemented a principal residence exception or a wealth tax yet, and why they should not?
Canada has, I'll talk about the principal residence real quick. Canada has a very, very generous principal residence exemption. In other words, if you have a $400,000 gain on your principal residence, it's exempt as long as you qualify. But if you have a $10 million gain in your principal residence, it's exempt as well. So in other words, there's an unlimited amount. Mm-hmm. I think in hindsight, the politicians probably regret having an unlimited ceiling. But to walk that back to something that is a little more restrictive is just it's a sacred cow to be politically incorrect, right? It's
a Pandora's box.
It very much is. Although from a policy perspective, even practitioners like me, there's a good chunk of practitioners like me that think, if you're going to tax capital gains, which includes an element of inflation, and I get that, then there should be likely a ceiling. The United States, for example, has a $250,000 ceiling, $500,000 for married couples. Not sure that's the right answer either, to be frank, but that just shows you that our biggest neighbor has a ceiling, and it's probably closer to the right answer than an unlimited ceiling. So at some point, some courageous government is going to have to pick this up and try to do it. I don't think it's this government. They're just too ideologically driven and too scared on the politics side to take it on. And frankly, it would be a disaster for any political party. So that's my response on principal residence. I don't think it's they're not that ballsy. On the wealth tax, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation released, they did a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information, asking for any materials that the government has on the possible introduction of a wealth tax, and they finally got it, and they released links to it in their Financial Post article roughly 2 years ago. And when you go to that link and take a look at it, first of all, it's heavily redacted, but it provides clear evidence that they're looking at it, or they were looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I don't think they've introduced it now is because the historical implementation of a wealth tax around the world has been disastrous. It just doesn't raise the revenue. It encourages people to leave, like France, for example. That's the most recent example where they finally abolished their wealth tax. I think it was 2016. They retained elements of the wealth tax on certain real estate, but that's it. And so I think there's only, I want to say off the top of my head, and I've lectured on this a lot, but I think there's only 5 countries remaining in the world that have a wealth tax, but it's usually on real estate, and Norway tends to be the poster child for left-leaning academics on this. But if you actually dig into Norway's wealth tax, it's pretty minimal, doesn't raise a lot of revenue, but it sounds good. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I don't think we'll have one. But if we keep up, if this Liberal government gets elected again with its free spending, it would shock me if there's a wealth tax. But you just never know, because if they don't curtail spending, they have to do something on the revenue side. And so they could be stupid enough to introduce one, but that would be really, really silly.
Perfect. And then my final question before we do a bit of a quick future outlook is, what are your thoughts on the latest foray into the subsidization of the electric vehicle movement? I know you touched a little bit upon it in our first half. What are your thoughts on the latest decision?
I wrote a Financial Post piece on this because I probably missed it on the first time when the Northvolt and Stellantis and Volkswagen subsidies were announced. But it turns out that those subsidies, which are into the billions of dollars, it turns out that they negotiated a tax-free deal for those. Normally, mm-hmm. when you receive government subsidies, the recipient pays tax. Mm-hmm. But they introduced a provision which quietly got passed in the Canada Gazette that these subsidies were without tax. And so I was blistering in my piece on the Financial Post on that. But I think it's horrible for Canadians. Anytime you're picking winners and losers, especially with this amount of money, we're talking billions now. I think I said in the first segment, it's approaching 50 billion. When you actually look at a population of 40 million, and the actual tax-paying people, I mentioned in the first segment that the top 10% pay roughly, I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. I've got it here.
The top 10%?
53%.
Yeah, top 10%. Yeah, 53. So it's that group that is paying for those billion-dollar subsidies. And what's the rate of return? My guess is negligible. The parliamentary budget officer tried to do a payback period. Mm-hmm. And they estimated 7 years, but they was so heavily caveated that you could tell that their eyes were rolling when they did that. And so long story short is I think this is a looming disaster economically. It already is an economic disaster, but this just adds to the pile, and it's so horrible.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Was it Stellantis or was it one of the, I can't remember which one it was from the original subsidized automakers, was even bringing in foreign workers to actually work to build the manufacturing plants and operate the facilities. So they handed them this sweetheart deal, and then at the end of the day, it didn't even create any jobs for any Canadians. They literally just airmailed however many billions of dollars out of the country and over to, I believe they were Korean workers, if I'm not mistaken. Korean. So okay, I'm not off on that.
I believe it's VW and Stellantis both, if I'm not mistaken. But it's just a horrible thing all the way around. It's unbelievable.
The most economically illiterate government in the history of Canada. Kim, we obviously talked a lot about the challenges our country is facing. If things were to change, other than the government, what adjustments would be highest on your priority list?
Well, let's fingers crossed that we do have a more logical government after an election in October of 2025, if not before, fingers crossed. High on my agenda of things would be to have a comprehensive tax review reform. I'm already on record and saying realistically we won't have another Carter Commission, but some sort of limited form. I would hope that the government of the day would focus on productivity issues as it relates to tax. And high on my agenda for that would be reduction of personal tax rates. We are not attracting the best and the brightest because of our high tax rates. The easy thing to think about is, are we attracting NHL free agents to Canada? No, we're not. And tax contributes to that. And so high on the agenda would be a reduction of personal rates and probably an increase in the consumption tax to compensate for that. And then like massive cuts to spending, including a massive reduction to the civil service. I would love to see a 40% reduction, and I'm just pulling that number out of my.
Are you kidding? After they waggled their finger at Bell Canada for laying off a much smaller percentage than that?
Yeah, that's unbelievable. But we are way, the public sector growth in this country is out of control, and we need to get that back into control. So those are my magic wand ideas off the top of my head.
I like that. Sorry, Dad, I just need to jump in really quickly. Kim, you mentioned NHL free agents. That's obviously a subject that is near and dear to my heart. The utilization of RCAs. I don't know how familiar you are with them, but
very familiar. Yeah,
I figured. There's a bit of a misnomer out there that people believe that RCAs allow it to basically be equivalent for anybody who's any Canadian team who's trying to attract talent compared to the non-tax jurisdictions in the United States. Can you confirm or deny that notion?
To suggest that RCAs put them on an equivalent basis is just naivety to the extreme, right? That is certainly a tool that in the right circumstances might be attempted to be utilized, but to suggest that it's the answer is naivety.
Well, it's a tax deferment scheme. It doesn't mean that the tax goes away. And
correct.
Oh my God, that's another. As you can see, I have a few
another
subjects
episode.
And exactly. I'd really love to get into the tax side of professional sports with you, because I think it's a fascinating topic. But that'll be a discussion for another day. Dad, back over to you. Sorry.
No, I was just going to comment on the growth of the civil service. That's done by design, because they're just creating more voters for the Liberal Party, and that's their sole purpose in allowing that.
The more people that are reliant on the fisc, the better for the existing government, right? So
exactly. Well, Kim, like healthcare in this country, taxation is an extremely delicate yet crucial topic. And yet I don't believe enough people spend an appropriate amount of time educating themselves on the impact of the decisions made by our policymakers, although I do encourage them to spend more time. Hopefully our discussion today will help open some eyes and provide some much needed perspective. Well, we'd love to spend all day talking about this topic. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So if people want to get in touch with you, where should they go?
I've got a number of ways to get a hold. My personal website is kimgcmoody.com. And then my firm that I founded is moodystax.com or moodysprivateclient.com. Those are two easy ways to get a hold of me.
Excellent. And perfect. Kim, thank you very much. I'll turn it over back to Bill to wrap it up.
No, this is a great conversation, and there are lots of similarities, and I joked about this earlier between Americans and Canadians, and one of them, unfortunately, guys, is that not enough people pay enough attention to what the government is doing with their money. And I don't know that I've got an easy fix or a simple fix for that one. I mean, I don't know how you drag people, to learn. They just need to pay attention. Part of it is my own personal belief that everybody who participates in a system should be actively paying into the system, so that there is no such thing as a person who pays no taxes. I'm all with a progressive tax system. I just A little iffy on some people getting by paying nothing at all because it doesn't matter. And in the United States, like in Canada, there are a lot more people who don't pay than who do bear the burden of paying for the entire system. That's a great conversation. Thank you so much, Kim. It's a pleasure. I hope that they have you back for at least another podcast and another edition. John and Alex, I want to thank you for facilitating an intelligent and great, interesting conversation. As we get out of here, as I always do, I ask, what is the best way for somebody who's listening who wants to get in contact with you? So John, Alex, what's the best way?
Best way is to go to our website, which is medwealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca, or to send us an email at info@medwealth.ca. Fantastic.
Thanks, guys. The other thing that if you are a listener listening to this and not a subscriber can do, which is really easy, is hit the follow button, become a subscriber. That way, every time John and Alex drop a new episode of Prescribing Prosperity, you will be notified and you can give it a listen. I also would ask that if you like this podcast, if you find it interesting, entertaining, and useful, to tell people about it. Word of mouth is very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Bill Tucker on behalf of John, Alex, and everybody at MedWealth Financial. Thank you for taking the time to listen today, and I would remind you that you can go out today and make it a great day. Or not. It's a choice. Thanks for listening, and until next time.
Thank you for listening to Prescribing Prosperity. Visit our website at med-wealth.ca. That's med-wealth.ca for more information or to connect with us for a consultation. Don't forget to click the follow button to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and their guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of IPC Securities Corporation. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investment advice. Always seek the advice of a qualified and licensed financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment or retirement planning. MedWealth Financial Services can provide a private consultation to help you determine the suitability of any guidance discussed on the show.